Welcome back to Skills Upgrade, a Talking Drupal mini-series following the journey of a Drupal 7 developer learning Drupal 10. This is episode 8. I'm Amy June Heinlein. I'm a Drupal mentor coordinator, and I work at the Linux Foundation as their certification community architect. During this mini-series, we have followed a Drupal 7 developer as he upgrades his skills to work on Drupal 10 projects with the ultimate goal of supporting the Drupal 10 project through contributing to the community. This is a weekly show. Each week, a mentor will review the developer's progress, answer questions, and set goals for the upcoming week. Our developer is Chad Hester on D.O. He is an enterprise technical consultant and solutions architect with a background in website development of over 20 years. Mike Anello, he's Ultimike on D.O, is co-founder and vice president of Drupal Easy, a Drupal training and consulting firm based in Central Florida. If we remember back to episode 7, Chad was given the homework of writing a functional test for the Smart Date module. The test was fairly straightforward. He was tasked with having the scenario of a user puts in an end date prior to the start date. Mike walked through the contribution process from issue creation to creating a merge request to working with the maintainer to get the test merged. I love it when folks learn how to contribute, and I'm very curious to see how it went.
How's it going, Chad? Big week this past week?
Yeah, lots more like rubber hitting the road. And I think all of the training that we've done so far kind of culminated into a single week. It was good all the way to the end.
Right. And so I was a little bit involved with your work over the past few days, but I want to let you kind of drive the story today. So let me set the table. In our last episode, I tasked you with writing a new functional test for the Smart Date module. And a fairly simple test where you were going to make sure that if a user put in for a date range, if the user put in an end date that was before a start date, then upon submitting the entity that had that field, the Smart Date field, it would display the proper error and letting the user know that no, they cannot put an end date that is before the start date. That was the goal, to write an automated test for that. I believe I said that all correctly, right?
Yeah, that's spot on.
Okay.
Creating the test, getting obviously the community knows that patches are a thing, and now issue forks are a thing. But we went.
No, they're not a thing. Patches are not a thing anymore. I've never heard patches. So in the week before, so we've been leading up to this. This is kind of like your big capstone project for the Skills Upgrade podcast here. We had you looking at the examples module, some testing examples in there, and basically setting up your local so that you can run PHP unit tests.
Yep.
Also looking at some other, example modules, just to kind of get you comfortable with the type of code that hopefully you're going to need to either refer to and or implement in this test. So why don't you let me know? So how did it go?
I think getting into testing beforehand was really helpful, making sure that the environment was up and running. So when I went to create the test, I knew where to do it. For the most part, I had a sense of the code. So I got the framework, pulled kind of what I thought would be a good recipe, if you will, from a few other tests relative to what we were doing here. I also went into the module itself to see, okay, what happens if I'm just a normal human being using the UI? What is the actual error that I see, just to get a sense of what it is that I'm testing against.
Always a good idea with a functional test.
Yeah. So thankfully I got that, wrote my code on the first pass. I knew that I would probably run into some issues with the array for setting the different keys, but
So wait, so we're talking about the edit array. So
yeah,
just let me just paint a picture so that folks know what you just said there. So as part of this test, we're kind of imagining that a user is going to an entity add page, and I'll just say a node add page. And that node has a Smart Date field, a Smart Date range field, And so the test, you have to kind of imagine that the test is going to that page. The test is entering in a start date and an end date. And then the test is hitting the save button. And so
Yeah.
what Chad is talking about, the array, I often call it the edit array. I think a lot of folks writing tests call it the edit array. A lot of times it's $edit, not exclusively though. But when you're writing a test, that edit array contains the data that's going to be submitted for that particular form.
Yep, that's the one. That's the stuff. And I think anybody that's used to Drupal 7 and even many earlier iterations, they're used to dealing with arrays of very complex structure. But when you're using something for like, I'm just filling in the node edit form and here are the keys that matter to me.
Right.
Just knowing what those keys are, I think can be a little bit of a challenge. But just rekindling from my Drupal 7 days, you can just go inspect the form. And a lot of times you'll be able to see in like the name attribute for the input field or something like that, what field does this relate to? What keys are in that array? So I went that route. And I think I got pretty close. There were a few tweaks that I had to make after running some tests, but we'll get into how that unfolded.
Not unsurprisingly, I think the biggest challenges that you had were not necessarily with the code that you were writing.
No, I think the code was probably the easiest part, to be completely honest. So I ran into a few errors, and I think you had mentioned that I should try other tests if I run into problems with my own test, just to kind of do a little comparison. So I did that with like the node module, the address
Yep.
module, just to see what would happen. And sure enough, I was running into some pretty massive errors. And there are a lot of things that we can like kind of itemize as to what we fixed. But yeah, that was the 95% of the fix, was getting through a lot of that stuff.
So let's elaborate on that a little bit. So you had issues running core tests, it sounds like. You were just kind of running to make sure that you could run tests. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. On the core tests, I was seeing things like database issues, and I'll be honest, I'm not even sure what was exactly causing it. So I kind of backpedaled a little to figure out, okay, is something wrong with my local environment? In this case, I have like a 1 terabyte local drive, and it was down to 76 gigs. So I did a little bit of cleanup, and then I brought it all the way up to like 0.5 terabyte free, which was great. Just clear out a Final Cut Pro library, that sort of thing. Make sure there's room. I shut down Docker, ddev, restarted the whole thing, and those errors actually went away, but they came back a few times. So I just got a sense of like, maybe if I start with a fresh environment, maybe some sort of condition is happening where that error propagates. So that's how I pushed through the initial set, but there were other errors that came up as well.
Were these
One
functional
related
tests?
functional kernel. There were a number of different types of tests that were running, especially with, I mean, Node is such a massive module that to run that test takes maybe 5-10 minutes.
I mean, if you were running functional JavaScript tests, then I could understand that there's going to be issues because the setup for functional JavaScript tests is different. I think we mentioned that last episode, which is why we started with a functional test. All right, let's put that issue aside for now.
Yeah,
because I think the other issue. Well, go ahead. Yeah, you go.
I also at first I was just going to use Composer to clone things and then start working on it, and then obviously it's like, but what are you committing to? You're not committing to the main repo for the entire project. So lo and behold, at first I also cloned just the dev branch, which is not the right thing to do. Thankfully, you pointed out a really good article that really broke it down, and there's a hidden. It says show commands right beside where you make your issue fork, and it's hidden by default. So it was so easy for my eyes to just quickly overlook it. As soon as that was expanded, it was very obvious that was on the wrong Git repo and the wrong branch as a result. So I sorted that out. There was another issue with my remotes not connecting correctly, so I couldn't really push. And I kept running into issues even when I was pushing to the wrong repo. I kept getting authorization issues where I didn't create a public access token yet. So that's something that you'll have to do. I tried my password for D.O. That definitely did not work. It was the public access token that did actually work eventually.
Right. So let's take a step back from all that. So, and
Yeah.
this is a very common pain point for new code contributors to Drupal projects. Is just understanding like the whole issue fork system, so to speak. And if you want to, work locally and then make a commit and push to an issue fork, like what is the setup for that? And granted, it's one of those things where once you've done it once or twice, you
Mhm.
look at it and go, oh, that's no big deal. Just got to bing, bang, boom, and you're done. But as you witnessed, personally, doing it the first time, it's not super intuitive.
Mhm.
And there is not an obvious, source of documentation for it. I was very curious to see if you were going to, it almost sounds mean for me to say, like if you were going to find that documentation page on your own,
Yeah.
because it's tricky to know that, even if you know how to write Drupal modules, it's still tricky, I think, that first
Yeah.
time to
I,
go in and say, okay, I want to create an issue fork and push some changes to this issue fork and create a merge request. Well, that's, you know, there's some, I don't want to call it like, well, let's call it GitLab foo to do.
yeah.
You got to know a couple things. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think this is an issue we encounter a lot in development communities in general, which is the document proliferation. And that's not to say that documentation is bad. It's not bad, but it becomes an information architecture problem of navigating to the documentation that you really need at the right time. I don't think
Right.
that I did encounter the main article for using GitLab to contribute to Drupal. I just didn't take that one extra step further about creating the issue forks, or maybe I skimmed it and didn't read the whole
Yeah.
thing. So I think that was still a good call out.
I think it's also, for me, sometimes it's, and I know the folks who write Drupal documentation are going to hate me saying this, so I apologize in advance. Sometimes it's a trust issue with documentation on Drupal because there's so much documentation that for me, I don't always trust the documentation at first glance. I will normally look at the last updated date. And for me, that if it's in the last year, okay, probably it's going to be, it's going to be pretty spot on, unless it's something that I know is evolving. And quite frankly, like Drupal's GitLab integration is still evolving. So yeah, I think that can be a little bit, a little bit scary or problematic. I'm not even sure what the right adjective is there. So we were on Slack a little bit over the past few days while you were trying to figure out why you couldn't push, and I actually chuckled a little bit because I kind of walked you through troubleshooting it, and eventually you demonstrated that you would only clone the main repository, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, well, of course the maintainer doesn't want Chad just pushing to his repository willy-nilly. So I kind of nudged you in the right direction of you should only be pushing to your issue fork. And I think that's when I gave you the link to that documentation page.
Yeah, it
But
was also that screenshot that you provided of like this is how you set up the connection with the repo specific to your issue
right.
fork because it's a forked repo that's what I should be connecting to. And I think when I had originally raised my hand and said, "Wait a minute, if I use Composer for this, then that doesn't seem right." And I think the guidance originally was, yeah, you should be using the default branch on the Git repo instead of using Composer, which so far so good. That makes general sense, but
Right.
it's that extra step of the issue fork that I think I missed.
I also think it's a little bit counterintuitive that the best practice is that the first thing you should do if you want to work on, we'll use smart date since that's what you're working on. If you want to work on a smart date issue fork, best practice dictates the first thing you should do is you should indeed clone the main repository, the
Yeah,
main smart date repository. And then after that, you add a new remote for the issue fork to that
yeah,
repository. And I think that's a little bit different than if you're working like on an open source project that's just hosted on GitHub. You
Mhm.
click a button that says create fork, and then you clone that, and then you get to work. So it's a little bit more, let's say Drupal is a little bit less streamlined than that.
And Git has itself changed since Drupal 7 a little bit, not
Sure.
significantly, but enough that when you're pushing, pooling, and things like that, being sensitive to like what's your remote, how is that set up, what's your branch.
I
That
think there's a real opportunity. Oh, I'm sorry, I cut you off. What did you say?
I said I had to really jog my memory a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it gets changed a little bit, but not that much. The concepts haven't changed, though. I mean, the
Yeah,
big picture concepts haven't changed. I think there's a real opportunity for like a graphic designer to put together some type of image that demonstrates how Drupal issue forks work and how you need to set them up. Because I think just getting folks past the whole there's two repositories you're going to be working with. You're going to clone from the real one, but then you're going to be pushing to this temporary one, and
mm-hmm.
the two are related, and it's only up to the maintainer or one of the maintainers if they choose to take one of the commits from the temporary one and bring it into the real one.
Yeah,
For me, especially when I teach Git, I use I draw it out. I draw stuff like this out all the time, and I find that really helps just kind of cement that knowledge. So I think that there's a real opportunity for an evergreen, Drupal documentation page. Maybe it's in addition to the one that I sent you. That just
yeah,
basically has a diagram of the relationship between these repositories, the in issue fork and the main one.
and I think also rebasing, because this is a moving target. That
Yes.
the live working branch is constantly changing,
Yes.
especially with a module like Smart Date, which is very popular
Well,
in the community.
yeah, but uh, you hit a very unique, time, and dare I say, once in a lifetime for Smart Date module. You were working on your test over the same few days that the Smart Date maintainers and contributors decided to switch from Drupal CI to GitLab CI. So that
Yeah,
threw additional wrenches in the works, so to speak.
yeah.
Yeah,
But I think it's good to illustrate that our community is constantly evolving, and
yeah,
it's good to pay attention to when those changes are happening, how it might impact our workflows, and what we're
right.
trying to achieve.
And the
There
other
was,
thing, you did mention rebase, so I do want to mention this
yeah,
because rebase, for folks who are like Git curious or only comfortable with a few Git commands, rebase is one of those commands that scares the pants off people. And the idea is basically that as the maintainers are making changes to the main repository, you could be working in your forked repository on your change.
yeah,
So, like you said, it's a moving target. So, when you said rebase a few minutes ago, let's simplify what that means. That basically means getting your issue fork up to date with the newest changes in the main, let's say, Smart Date module.
yeah.
Um, and granted, you can 100% get your issue fork up to date by using the git rebase command. But
Mhm.
as I demonstrated for you, or I demonstrate's not the right word, but I pointed you to, and again, it's not the easiest thing to find, which is crazy. In the GitLab interface for Drupal code, there is what did the button say? Update code or something like that. There is a button that you can click that will perform the rebase. I'm using air quotes on rebase. I don't know why it's actually a rebase, but there is a button you can click that will do that for you. So you don't have to actually worry about running a git rebase yourself.
I noticed that button. I did not use it. I did everything locally, which I guess I would have to pull down anyway if I
Oh,
did
that's
that.
fine. Yeah.
But yeah. Um, but I think you make a good point. I mean, it can be even more scary for a person who is making changes to a more popular file as opposed to a new file like what I was doing, where
Right.
you have to reconcile changes. Like, okay, the community just changed this, but I was working on this other thing. Great. Now I have to pay that much more attention to just reconciling those differences in a way that doesn't break everything.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. You want to avoid code conflicts at all costs.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I get that. And, I think for someone of your skill level who's interested in tests, finding a module like Smart Date that does not, I don't want to insult Martin and the other maintainers, it doesn't have, let's say, a high percentage of code coverage, we'll say. I think this is like kind of the perfect entry where this is your file. It's not going to conflict with anyone else's file unless someone gets in there and starts, helping you. And there I am using air quotes, helping you. All right. So yeah, this was kind of the gist of what I really wanted to talk about today. And I'm going to go into the code a little bit more as well.
Um, I did have one other curveball.
Oh yeah.
Since we're not using Composer to pull code, Composer resolves dependencies. But if we're cloning a Git repo, we don't get any benefit of that. So being aware of any dependencies, Smart Date, you kind of have to deal with that on your own, which you can do with Composer, and that's certainly fine if you just do one dependency at a time. But that was another catch that I ran into.
Right. And so there's actually a fairly, I'll use the word simple. It's simple once you know it, way to deal with that. And it's funny because I'm actually I'm going to teach this technique in my module development course literally tomorrow. I was prepping for it earlier today, and it's part of my lesson tomorrow. But you can clone. Let's say, well, let's use the address module because address module does have external dependencies. Let's say you wanted to work on the issue fork of the address module. If you just clone address module, like you said, you'll get the address module code, but you won't get its dependencies, and because you're not working with Composer. So what I normally do, and other folks out there might have other ideas, I will normally clone that into my project root into a modules directory.
Mm-hmm.
So a sibling of the web directory. And then in my project's composer.json file, I will set up a path repository that's pointing at that modules directory. And then at that point, you can use composer require and then the name of the module, and it will pull it from that path, the modules directory, and get all the dependencies.
Okay.
So it's pretty straightforward. Again, once you see it.
Yeah.
Going back to what I was talking about a second ago, this was not super surprising to me that the biggest challenges for you over this past week were the issue fork workflow stuff.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that you didn't have any issues with the code, as we can talk about in a moment. But is it fair to say that the biggest challenge for you was just the workflow?
Yeah, I would say the workflow. If you get the steps right, you leap forward. But if you get them wrong, you may not know that you're getting them wrong, and then you really have to backpedal and just inspect every step you've taken.
Right.
So I think that was the real hang up that I ran into.
Right. So let's talk about debugging tests a little bit.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, you had a good point to really help me out because I felt like I was so close. Like once we resolved some of those environmental issues, I started to run the test and get like really good results. The results that I would expect to be seeing if I just wrote this and didn't have any problem with the commit.
And you were very close. Like when I finally looked at your entire, after I felt you were past the workflow issues, and I looked at that test class that you created, I wasn't going to give you exact issues. I wasn't going to tell you fix line 13.
Yeah.
But I did kind of want to lead you down the path of, okay, if you're getting this issue, how should you, how do you debug it? And, obviously you can use Xdebug, but that's a different skill set that, folks may or may not have. So normally what I do before I go to Xdebug, especially if it's a functional test, I use the browser test output stuff, which I think was new for you, right?
Yeah, that was brand spanking new for me. I don't think that even existed for Drupal 7, or if it did, it certainly wasn't popular.
Right. So describe what it is. Let's see how well you know it now.
Yeah, there were two variables to set. You had me set up the PHP unit.xml, which helped me run PHP units tests and make sure that those were working. So at least we that out from being the issue. And then after that, I was running into a problem where, I'm making an assertion, and I'm confused. Am I writing the correct value for my edit array, or am I making the wrong assertion for what error code I was checking for to see does it show up on screen? And suffice it to say that both were the problem, but in this particular instance, it wasn't firing correctly because I had the wrong string. And I found out why, because it was actually the field name that it was including. So the one that I had set up in the UI, the field name was called something different. So I just lopped off the front since that was a dynamic portion of that statement. But it brought up a good question. If Martin came along or somebody else in the community came along and changes that error code string, then the test would then break. And I guess that would run and somebody would see that in a merge request.
Right.
But it makes me wonder if using just a plain, not translated string like that is really the ideal way to do it in the test. It worked. That's great. But I think anytime you write code, there's always room for improvement.
Right. And that's an extremely common way of writing an assertion, especially when you're testing error conditions, is to make sure that the right error message is being thrown. There's other ways. To quote someone that I talked to, and honestly, I forget if it was at, I was lucky enough to go to New Jersey camp and mid camp in the past couple of weeks. Someone reminded me of a great quote where, perfect is the enemy of good enough.
Oh, yes.
Right? If the test works, the test works. Could you spend another 8 hours making it perfect? Sure. Is your client going to want to pay for you to spend 8 more hours fixing a test that already works? Probably not. So what did this? So you kind of danced around it, but you didn't say specifically what does that browser test output stuff do?
So there were two variables that it set. One of the variables is
XML.
Yeah, for the PHP unit XML. One of them sets the directory that the output would go into, so the browser test underscore output underscore directory, and the other is the browser test underscore output underscore base underscore URL. So that's just it's setting up a test domain, if you will, and what would that be? So once I ran the test, took a look at the the output in that directory. The first one was meaningless, but I started to understand what was going on. It's just iterating through multiple tests, and I could see my test name, the .php file that I'd created, is a whole set of HTML files. So I could tell which one I should pay attention to. I opened that. I'm on Mac. It's in my local directory. I could just open it right up in my browser, and thankfully there's a pager at the top of the files as well. So I was able to go just next. And sure enough, I saw the error message was not what I had typed in. So I corrected that. And I also triple checked the inspect element on the form fields to see, okay, is there something that I'm missing? I think I was double prefixing the field underscore. So I corrected that. And for the time variable, I only did hours and minutes. So I added seconds. I don't know if that had an impact, but it's a string. I don't think it did.
Because I actually fixed your test without telling you. And I didn't touch that, and everything was working fine. So the browser test output directory stuff is really helpful because it basically, for every Drupal get in your functional test or Drupal login, it just outputs the HTML page. And often, a lot of these tests you're using Stark, so these are tiny little HTML files, but they show you exactly what the test is. I'm using air quotes here, seeing. And so, I find them very, very valuable to utilize. I don't leave them on all the time because it could really result in a giant pile of files on your hard drive. So be very selective with turning that on and off.
So you can just comment it out when it's not being used. And I saw a couple of those lines were already commented out.
Yeah. All right. So big takeaways. So we're going to do a wrap-up episode because you're close. So I don't think we've said it yet, but your test, there's a merge request and it's awaiting review, I believe, at this point. That's good. And there is one little wrinkle having to do with you found some schema that was missing. So I believe that, Martin will probably accept that that schema change as well, which is, that's above and beyond. That's that's an extra little merit badge on your shoulder, whatever we're doing there. But how do you feel about, granted, you had the advantage of having myself and a couple other folks, kind of there helping you.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Like, how, overall, the process?
Yeah, I think for first timers, if I'm looking at someone that's never done Drupal dev, this is a pretty big mountain to climb.
Yeah.
Even if you are familiar with older school Drupal dev and issue queues and things of that nature, there's a lot of things that have changed since Drupal 7. So I think having you and Martin and the Talking Drupal team kind of helping without giving me too much information, so trying to let me figure out what I can on my own, I think that was a really wonderful experience in the sense that it could fast forward some of the things or prevent me from barking up the wrong tree, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I think that for something like this, it's incredibly difficult to learn it in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult if you do not have access to the Talking Drupal Slack or me or any of the other folks. Yeah, definitely at least an order of magnitude more difficult. I think also that because and again, I apologize to the documentation folks, but for stuff like this, it feels like the documentation is fractured. Let's say
Yeah.
it exists. It's just not in one place. Setting up the PHP unit.xml file. That's a whole thing. If you don't know what you don't know, that becomes like a whole thing. I think that, and I'm going to say this, but it is 100% not to toot my own horn. It's more about the value of having a mentor, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I spent, and let's just look at the last week, maybe an hour working with you on Slack. And it definitely wasn't even a straight, start the clock and stop the clock. It was like 5-10 minutes here and there. But, the end result of me spending, again, maybe an hour, and, granted, I'm not counting all of the podcasts we've done and everything. And quite honestly, you and I have not had a whole lot of, I'm not going to use the word contact, but I have not been helping you a whole lot outside of the podcast.
Yeah.
Here and there now and then, but not a whole lot. So I guess my point is, for an experienced Drupal developer to, spend maybe an hour and a half of their time to get someone of your skill level to the point where you can, have a merge request for a new functional test, that's a huge win for the community. And that's a huge, hopefully, this will encourage other folks to step up and mentor, because it doesn't take a ton of time. It really doesn't. You just, you don't do it for the people. You just kind of point them in the right direction, which is what I hope I did for you.
You definitely did. And I think something that I've been actively doing myself in the community since I've been a part of the Drupal community is encourage people to network, get to know people who have, a passion. A lot of people in this community have a passion. And for some people, it's back-end module development or writing tests or documentation. But as you network, you get to accumulate more relationships. And it's not just a Pokemon collect them all sort of thing. It's just you develop these professional networks, and it helps you in your career and it helps you in your education. But I couldn't agree more about the mentorship side of things. Like,
right.
If I had problems back in the day with, say, commerce, I knew that I could get in touch with several of the people who worked on the commerce module stuff if I really couldn't figure it out on my own, But I think this also gives credence to, you do what you can on your own to look up the error. Even if it's not your error, it's somewhat similar. It may still point you in a strong direction and make you rethink the code or what you're doing, or hell, even just taking a break from the code that you've written, go for a walk, think about it for a bit, and come back. And sometimes that can make a bit of a difference. But every agency that I've worked with, where there's a development team, there's that concept of mentorship. There's that concept of, I'm going to give you the resources you need at whatever level you're currently at, and say, Drupal Slack, the Drupal.org website. Those are your biggest friends, but they're not your only friends, and
Right.
kind of walking people through those resources, but still being like, if you've gotten through that much and you're still feeling a bit lost, having a mentor or having a community that you can tap into means that you're not just flapping in the breeze. And that's what really brought me to open source in general, away from the Microsoft programmer life that I originally had, is a community that's very self-supporting. And I don't, to your point, I don't think it's perfect, but I think that it's very self-aware and it's trying constantly to evolve in those areas.
So let's do this. We're going to do one more episode
Okay.
because while we're almost complete, the merge request is out there. It has not been merged yet. So we're going to do one more episode. So your homework between now
Okay.
and the next episode is, and we won't record the next episode until this merge request is accepted, which I don't expect to take more than a few days based on what I've seen. In addition to kind of shepherding that all the way through, what I think would be really useful is create a list, and it doesn't have to be detailed, just talking bulleted list of, if you were going to, or if someone came to you, Chad, and said, hey, I know a little bit about Drupal, module development, but I want to do what you did. I want to, contribute to a module. I want to write, a test, as a merge request. What are the steps that you would outline for that person to do so? And I mean, I want, again, it doesn't be a lot of detail, but I want the big steps, and I'll get you started. Like step one, have a fresh Drupal 10 environment on your local.
Yeah.
Right. And then go from there and just think about everything you had to do to get to where you are. And I think that'll be a really nice way to kind of finish up this little mini series.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Drupal can be overwhelming, especially if you want to do a whole lot with it, especially if you are champing at the bit to go do that work professionally, or maybe you work for a department and your boss is hounding you to get started. It takes time, and I think that it requires that degree of respect and investment. So yeah, I think I can take a look through our show notes and our homework assignments and some of the other things that I've kind of learned along the way, and put something together that would be good to share with our community here.
Sounds like a plan. I will see you, and hopefully, well, it should be, I think, about 2 weeks is what we talked about based on some scheduling stuff, right?
Yep. Yep.
All right.
That's it. And then shortly thereafter, DrupalCon.
Woo-hoo. All right. Well, I'll see you in a couple weeks.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks.
What a fantastic episode. Chad and Mike did a really good job breaking down what Chad did this week for the functional test. That edit array contains the data for that particular form. Chad explained how he mapped the test to the fields. Super helpful for those who haven't learned it that particular way. Chad's challenges weren't with the code as I had anticipated, but with the core tests themselves. He compared his tests to the tests in the address module and came across the same errors. He saw some database issues, so he cleared out some of his local drive. He restarted DDev. The errors resolved but came back, so he restarted his local with a fresh Drupal build. I think it's so funny how we often find that this is part of the fix. Just scrapping what we have and starting can be a good solution. He went through some of his trials and tribulation, including remotes not working, not being on the right branch. But once again, Mike iterated that having extra support can make or break your learning curve. Chad has been in Talking Drupal Slack. He has a really good mentor. Mike is available. And it's important to not only learning the skills, but it gives folks the confidence to contribute back to the Drupal project. Episode 9 will be very exciting. Chad's homework is thinking about a developer learning this process with the goal of contributing, and Mike has tasked him in creating a list outlining the steps for success. Skills Upgrade is supported by Talking Drupal and Drupal Easy. You can visit talkingdrupal.com for this episode's show notes and resources, and you can visit drupaleasy.com and register for an upcoming intensive Drupal training course. You can learn more about our developer, Chad Hester, at chadkhester.com. And you can learn about our mentor, Mike Anello, at drupaleasy.com/contact-us. And he is Ultimike across most of the social media spaces. You can find me as Volkswagen Chick on Drupal Mastodon and LinkedIn. And as a courtesy to all of our Drupal members, the Linux Foundation is offering a discount of 30% off e-learning courses, certifications, and bundles with the code all uppercase Drupal24, and that is good through June 5th. And you can find all of this information in the show notes. And thank you, and we're really looking forward to next week, episode 9.